Before we get started, drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I always enjoy reading them. Now sit back, get comfortable, and let us begin today's story. The dining room of the pack house smelled like old wood and someone else's claim, and Suhn-joon had been on his knees for the better part of an hour trying to care about the sideboard instead of the door. The sideboard was worth caring about. Solid red oak, late 19th century, hand-cut dovetail joints so clean that the wood had held together for generations without a single loose corner. The damage was at the back panel, a split running almost the full width where something heavy had fallen against it years ago, and the veneer along the top rail lifting in long, dry curls where the moisture barrier had finally given out. He had his probe in the worst section of the split, measuring depth, when he heard boots on the hallway floor. He did not look up. Pack houses had foot traffic. He had been commissioned to restore the furniture, not to pay attention to who moved through the rooms. He kept his eyes on the probe, noted the depth, and reached for his notebook. The commission had been quoted for surface repair and refinishing. The probe was already telling him the damage went deeper than the photographs had shown. 3 sets of boots. They stopped in the doorway. He sat back on his heels and looked. There were 3 of them. 2 he did not know, standing in the slightly deferential way of pack members positioned behind their alpha. The one in front was Dong-hyun. Suhn-joon had known Dong-hyun would be here. The pack alpha's residence was public record, posted on the county designation registry. He had read the listing before accepting the commission. He had told himself knowing in advance would make it manageable. He would see the face, calibrate, and get on with the work. He had been wrong about what it would feel like to be looked through. Dong-hyun was looking at him the way a pack alpha looked at an unregistered stranger in his house. Assessing, careful, default neutral, not hostile, not warm. The face Suhn-joon had last seen at 17, softer then, less finished, was now the face of a man who had spent a decade making decisions and living inside every one of them. The jaw was the same, that particular stillness that meant he was paying attention even when nothing on the surface said so. The eyes were the same dark brown that Suhn-joon had memorized when he was young enough to think memorizing was something you did with places you planned to return to. The eyes did not recognize him. Dong-hyun crossed the room. He did it with the unhurried quality of someone who had never once needed to move quickly to establish authority, and he crouched at the sideboard a couple of feet from Suhn-joon and looked at the split with the same careful attention he had given the stranger on his floor. "How bad?" he said. Suhn-joon kept his voice even. "Worse than the photographs showed. The split goes deeper than the surface. I will need to revise the scope before I can give you an accurate timeline." Dong-hyun looked at the probe still in Suhn-joon's hand. He looked at the split. He looked, briefly and without apparent intention, at the inside of Suhn-joon's wrist, the skin just below the heel of the hand where the scent gland sat flat under years of blocker application. His gaze moved away before Suhn-joon could be entirely certain he had seen it at all. "You will stay for dinner," Dong-hyun said. It was not a question. It carried no warmth. A pack alpha's read on what was appropriate for an unregistered omega on his property. Nothing more than that. Suhn-joon looked up at the face he had loved, from a careful distance, for most of his life. "I appreciate it," he said. "I should get back to my measurements." Dong-hyun held the look for a moment past the ordinary length of one. Then he stood. He said something low to the pack members in the doorway and they moved off down the hall. Dong-hyun did not follow right away. He stood at the sideboard for another breath, his hand resting on the top rail near the lifting veneer, close to it, but not touching. Then he left. In the doorway, before they had gone, the 2 pack members had exchanged a look. One had said something to the other, quiet enough not to carry. Suhn-joon had not been able to read what it was. He put the probe back in his kit. He wrote the revised depth measurement in his notebook. He stayed on his knees on the pack house floor for another full minute before he could make himself reach for the next tool. He pressed his thumbnail into the soft inside of his wrist, over the blocker patch, and made himself breathe steadily. He had been very wrong. Harrow's bend had not changed in the ways towns usually changed. What it had done was settle further into what it already was, the way old furniture settled into its joinery over decades. The fishing co-op cranes ran the same schedule. The fog came in at the same hour. The dock planks had been replaced so many times they were technically new wood, but smelled identical to the old ones, because the water and salt got into everything here and made it the same regardless. He had grown up in this town. He had left in the spring of a year he did not let himself count precisely, on a bus with everything he owned. He had not come back. He had kept his scent blockers current and his commissions moving and his life small enough to fit in whatever room he was renting at the time. The commission had come through a restoration network he had been listed on for years. He had read the address and recognized it. He had looked up the registry to confirm what he already suspected. He had accepted the job anyway. The money was real. The work was real. None of it was a lie, and none of it was the whole truth. He ate something in his rented room above the hardware shop and went to sleep. In the morning, he went back to the pack house. The scope revision he handled with the pack house administrator. Suhn-joon explained the damage, gave the revised figure, and waited while she made a call. Proceed with the full restoration, she told him. The missing hardware would need to be cast from the surviving pair, specialty work that would take a couple of weeks. That was fine. He started stripping the damaged veneer that afternoon. He had spread his protective cloth and was kneeling with a heat gun and a palette knife, coaxing the lifted veneer away from the top rail without tearing what remained sound when Dong-hyun came in. He moved through the dining room with the purposeful ease of a man who had somewhere else to be, but was choosing not to be there yet. He set a glass of water on the table near Suhn-joon's kit, not close enough to be in the way, near enough to be within reach. Then he crouched at the sideboard and looked at the progress with the same quality of attention he seemed to bring to everything, complete and unhurried. "Glue?" he said, looking at the hide glue pot heating on Suhn-joon's portable double boiler. "Hide glue. It is what the original joinery used. Any modern adhesive would be stronger, but it would not move with the wood. You would get a joint that holds right up until the oak shifts with temperature change, and then you would have a worse split than the one you started with." Dong-hyun looked at the clamp already set on the lower section. "Has to be the right temperature? Has to be exact. Too hot, and it degrades before it sets. Too cool, and it does not penetrate the grain." He reached for the spatula and worked another thin line into the split. Oak moves. The glue has to move with it or the whole repair eventually fails. Dong-hyun watched him work for a moment. Suhn-joon kept his eyes on the joint. He was aware of the proximity in the specific way he had always been aware of Dong-hyun's proximity, which was a form of awareness that had nothing to do with the blocker patch on his wrist and everything to do with 15 years of practice in managing it quietly. Then Dong-hyun stood. He was already at the door when he said, without looking back, "There is a packed dinner Friday. You are welcome to it." Suhn-joon kept his eyes on the glue joint. "I will be working late Friday." A pause that lasted about one breath. Then Dong-hyun left. Suhn-joon let out the breath he had been holding and went back to the spatula. On the third day of the commission, he found the second problem. The back panel had concealed it. He had not been able to get a full look until the split was stabilized and he could ease the panel away from the frame. Behind it, in raw wood, no one would have seen without taking the piece apart. Someone had carved 2 characters into the surface, not decorative, not part of the original build. Cut with something narrow, old enough that the wood had darkened around the marks until they were only visible at an angle with the right light. He looked at them for a while. They were initials. 2 letters, close together, the cuts careful enough that whoever had made them had cared about the result even knowing no one would see it. A private thing, made in a private place, meant to stay. He photographed them, noted them in his file as a historical detail for client consultation, and went on with the work. He pressed the blocker patch on his wrist and turned the lamp to a better angle, and did not think about what it meant to find a secret kept inside a piece of furniture that had been in this house since long before either of them were born. Friday came and went. He worked late, as he had said. The house was quiet past the dinner hour. He finished the lower rail repair and cleaned his tools and sat for a moment on the protective cloth with his arms on his knees, looking at the piece. The pack house smelled like other people's lives, the accumulated scent of pack members who had lived and eaten and argued and grieved in these rooms. His own scent, suppressed to close to nothing, added nothing to it. He was a stranger here. He did not examine why sitting on this particular floor felt like something closer to the opposite of strange. He drove back to his room. On the way, he passed the road that turned off toward the shore path. He did not turn. He had taken that path every week of his childhood. Dong-hyun's father had run the pack then, a loose, sprawling thing that included anyone who showed up regularly enough to be considered a fixture. Suhn-joon had been a fixture. He had not been family. There is a difference, and he had understood it early, the way children understood things they were never told directly, through the quality of how adults looked at you when they thought you were not watching. He had been fed. He had been included. On the nights when his own home was too small for what was happening in it, he had been given a blanket on the packed common room floor without anyone making a thing of it. Gratitude was not the same as belonging. Dong-hyun, at 17, had been the kind of person who filled whatever room he was in without appearing to try, simply present in a way that organized the space around him. Suhn-joon had watched him from the edge of every room, close enough to feel the warmth of things without being close enough to need to explain why he wanted it. He had left because the periphery became untenable, not because of anything Dong-hyun did, because Suhn-joon had never once given him any indication there was anything to see. He had been invisible by choice. Leaving was the logical end of that choice. The fog was coming in off the water when he parked the truck. He sat with the window down for a minute, smelling the salt and the cedar and the faint diesel and brine that meant the co-op was running a late shift. Then he went upstairs and slept. The following week, Dong-hyun started coming to the dining room earlier in the afternoon. It was not something he announced or explained. He simply appeared at different times, sometimes when Suhn-joon was mid-process, sometimes when the work was mechanical enough to allow a conversation. He asked short questions and listened to the answers with the attention of someone genuinely interested rather than filling time. It was worse than indifference would have been. Indifference Suhn-joon could have filed away. One afternoon, he brought 2 cups of coffee from somewhere and set one near Suhn-joon's kit without comment, the same way he had left the water glass, calculated to be within reach without being in the way. Suhn-joon looked at it. Then he picked it up and drank it because the afternoon was cold, and the coffee was right in refusing it would have required a reason he did not have. The coffee smelled like dark roast gone slightly past its prime, which was how it smelled in every fishing town where the pot had been sitting since early morning because no one had time to make a fresh one. On Dong-hyun, it smelled different, closer, like something that had been there long enough to become part of the air. Suhn-joon drank the coffee and kept his eyes on the grain. "The initials," he said, when Dong-hyun had been standing near the sideboard long enough that not mentioning it felt more pointed than mentioning it. "In the back panel. I photographed them for the file. You will want to decide whether you want them preserved or whether I fill and refinish." Dong-hyun looked at the panel, now fully cleaned and exposed under the work lamp. He was quiet for a moment. "What letters?" Suhn-joon turned his tablet and showed him the photograph. 2 characters cut into the raw wood inside the frame, darkened with age, careful in the way of something made to last even in the dark. Dong-hyun went still. "Leave them," he said. "They'll be hidden once the panel goes back. You will know they are there, but you will not see them." "That is enough," Dong-hyun said, and something in the way he said it was not about the initials at all, and Suhn-joon did not press it. He made a note in the file. When he looked over a few seconds later, Dong-hyun's expression had settled into something that was not quite the neutral he usually wore in this room, and he shuttered it quickly when he registered Suhn-joon looking. "Pack used to gather in here," Dong-hyun said after a beat. Not as explanation, more like something that had been sitting in his mouth and finally came out. "When I was young, my father ran the pack from this house. There were a lot of people." Suhn-joon kept his voice careful. "What happened to them?" "My father died. Pack dissolved." He said it without inflection, the way you eventually learn to say things that had once been too heavy to carry. "Some people left the county. Some stayed, but unaffiliated. I built it back up after I took the position." A pause. "It is smaller now, more deliberate." Suhn-joon set down his brush. "Deliberate is better than big." Dong-hyun looked at him. The look lasted just slightly past the ordinary length of one, and it was not unfriendly. It was the look of someone who had heard a thing land in an unexpected place and was noting where it landed. "Are you registered with a pack?" Dong-hyun said. "Nomadic designation." "By choice?" "By habit," Suhn-joon said. "The work moves around." Dong-hyun was quiet for a moment. Harrow's Bend requires pack affiliation or a temporary exemption filing for unaffiliated Omegas staying longer than a short-term visit. "I know. I will file the exemption." "Or," Dong-hyun said in the particular way he had of saying things that were not actually without weight, "you could register with the pack for the duration of the commission. It is simpler." Suhn-joon looked up at him. "I am not pack. You would be affiliated for the work period. A practical arrangement." He held Dong-hyun's gaze for a moment. Dong-hyun looked back with the patient quality of someone who was not in the habit of pushing, but was also not the kind of person who withdrew an offer once made. "I will file the exemption," Suhn-joon said. Dong-hyun accepted this with a slight nod and left the room without pressing. Suhn-joon went back to his work and told himself the conversation had been entirely administrative, which was true, and that administrative conversations did not stay with you the way this one did, which was considerably less true. He filed the exemption that evening at the county office. On the drive back, he passed the turnoff for the shore path, the dock lights still running at the co-op, the corner below his rented room. He went upstairs and lay flat on the bed and stared at the ceiling and waited for the weight in his chest to stop behaving like it had mass and intention. It did not stop. Yoo-jin came to the dining room a few days after that. He came in without announcement, assessed the room in the manner of a man accustomed to having his assessments taken seriously, and looked at Suhn-joon on the floor near the sideboard with an expression that was politely curious and not especially warm. "You are the restoration worker," he said. "Yes. Unaffiliated Omega in pack territory for an extended stay requires a scent assessment on record, county code." Suhn-joon set down his tool. "I filed the exemption." "Exemption covers the initial period. You have been here longer." He was not unkind about it. He had the manner of someone presenting a logistical solution to a logistical problem, genuinely uninterested in how the person across from him felt about the options. "Assessment is faster and cleaner, covers the full duration without additional paperwork." Suhn-joon was about to answer when Dong-hyun came through the door. The quality of the room changed the moment Dong-hyun walked in. He took in the scene, Yoo-jin near the door, Suhn-joon on the floor, the residue of the conversation in the air, and the attention behind his eyes sharpened in a way Suhn-joon caught because he had spent years learning how to read what lived behind the neutral surface of Dong-hyun's face. "He has filed the exemption," Dong-hyun said. "He can extend it." Yoo-jin looked at Dong-hyun with the expression of a man noting something he found interesting, then tucked it away. "Of course," he said. He gave Suhn-joon one more brief assessing look, then left. Dong-hyun said nothing further about it. He set a folder of co-op paperwork on the table and worked through it in silence while Suhn-joon continued with the finish prep on the top rail. The room settled back into the particular quiet it had when it was just the two of them in it, the old house ticking around them in the afternoon cold, the work lamp warm on the oak. After a while, Dong-hyun said, without looking up from the manifests, "You have done this kind of work long? Long enough? You are good at it." "I know," Suhn-joon said. It was not the answer most people gave, and it made Dong-hyun look up from his paperwork. Suhn-joon kept his eyes on the grain and did not explain. "Did you apprentice somewhere?" "I learned from a woman in Northern California who had been doing restoration work for 40 years. I was with her for a couple of years." He paused. "She was the best person I have ever met at making something hold together that should have fallen apart." Dong-hyun was quiet. What happened to her? "She retired, sold the shop." He gestured at the kit. "I kept her tools." Dong-hyun looked at the kit and went back to his paperwork. They stayed in the quiet together. The sideboard's wood grew warmer under the oil Suhn-joon was working in, and the smell of linseed and old oak and the dark roast and rain smell that was simply Dong-hyun in an enclosed space settled over everything, and Suhn-joon breathed it carefully and did not allow himself to want it in the direct way it deserved. He was putting the lid on a jar of solvent when Dong-hyun said, more carefully than was usual for him, "There is a section of the shore path that floods at high tide this time of year. It'll close off in a few weeks. Worth seeing before it goes." Suhn-joon kept his hands on the jar. He knew the shore path. He had run it in every weather for years. He knew exactly where it flooded, and where the old iron fence post marked the original pack boundary, and what the water looked like when the grasses caught the morning light at the right angle. "Sure," he said. He did not look up to catch whatever was on Dong-hyun's face when he said it. They went on a morning when the tide was right, early enough that the fog had not burned off and the town was quiet. Dong-hyun showed up at the corner below the hardware shop, and they walked through the lower streets without much said between them, not quite side by side. Dong-hyun set the pace naturally, and Suhn-joon followed slightly behind, which was reflex, which was a habit he recognized as having a specific origin. The path was unchanged. This was not surprising, and was still a particular kind of feeling. The shore opened to the left of the trailhead, the water flat and colorless in the fog, and the path ran along the edge of it through salt grass and over the old plank bridges. Dong-hyun walked ahead once the path narrowed, and the fog muffled everything except the sound of their boots on the planks and the low, continuous sound of the water below. Suhn-joon watched Dong-hyun's back. He had this view memorized, which was embarrassing in a way that was also simply true. Dong-hyun stopped at the flooded section, a low stretch where the path dipped and the overnight tide had come in and not yet drained, leaving a few inches of cold seawater that turned the path into a mirror. He looked at it, and then he looked back at Suhn-joon, and there was something unguarded in his expression for a second that Suhn-joon almost missed because he was not expecting it. "It'll clear by afternoon," Dong-hyun said, "but it looks better like this." Suhn-joon looked at the flooded path. It did look better like this. The fog made the reflection soft, and the salt grass stood around it in a way that made the whole stretch look intentional, like something that had planned itself. "Yes," he said, "just that." Dong-hyun looked at him for a moment, and then he looked back at the water, and they stood there for a moment more than they strictly needed to before turning back. On the return, the path ran past the old iron fence post that marked what had been the original edge of pack territory when Dong-hyun's father was still running things. Suhn-joon saw Dong-hyun register it as they approached, a slight shift in his gait, his attention angling toward the post without his head turning all the way. Dong-hyun did not stop. He reached out as he passed and put his palm flat against the old iron, the way you touched things that were mostly walls now but had once been thresholds. Then his hand fell away and they kept walking. They were almost at the trailhead when Dong-hyun stepped ahead of Suhn-joon and reached across the path to move a branch that had come down in the night. It lay across the trail at about chest height, heavy enough to catch on a jacket, and Dong-hyun grabbed it and pulled it aside in one motion. His forearm came across the air directly in front of Suhn-joon's face, and the inside of his wrist, the skin over the scent gland, passed within a few inches of Suhn-joon's nose. Suhn-joon did not move. Dong-hyun did not move his arm immediately. For a breath, maybe two, neither of them did anything at all. Then Dong-hyun's arm came back slowly, and he stepped forward without apologizing and without explaining, and Suhn-joon followed, and they reached the road without anything further being said. "Good path," Suhn-joon said at the corner. "Yes," Dong-hyun said. They parted ways there. Dong-hyun toward the co-op, Suhn-joon toward the pack house. He walked the full block before he let himself pay attention to what was happening in his chest, which was that the scent that had come off the inside of Dong-hyun's wrist at that distance, dark roast and old rain and something warmer underneath that only surfaced up close, had gone directly into the part of his memory that did not ask permission before keeping things. His blocker patch was fresh. He was fine. The hardware arrived at the end of the following week, and the casts were good. He spent 2 days fitting and finishing, adjusting the fit on each drawer by hand, so everything moved exactly as it should. He cleaned the surviving drawer pulls and reset them. You could tell the difference if you knew where to look. Otherwise, the piece was whole. He finished the final coat of oil on a Thursday evening. The dining room was quiet. He sat back and looked at the piece in the lamplight the way he always did at the end of a restoration, not because there was anything left to check, but because it was the only form of ceremony he had. Looking, and the acknowledgement that it had been broken and was not broken now. Then he cleaned his tools, folded the cloth, put everything in the kit. He was writing the final note for the file when he heard the door. Dong-hyun came in and stopped when he saw the finished piece. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Suhn-joon looked up from the file. Dong-hyun was looking at the sideboard the way you looked at something that had gone back to being what it was supposed to be. And there was something in his face that was private and that he was not trying to hide. "It looks like it did when I was young," he said. "That is what restoration is supposed to do." Dong-hyun walked to the piece. He ran his thumb slowly along the top rail where the veneer had been lifting. No ridge, no seam. The wood was continuous and smooth under his hand. He pulled a drawer and it moved exactly the way it was supposed to. That weight and glide that the right hardware gave back to a piece after years of it going wrong. He stood at the sideboard for a moment with his hand on the open drawer, and Suhn-joon watched him from across the room and did not say anything. "I did not ask who you were," Dong-hyun said. He said it to the sideboard, not to Suhn-joon, in the way of someone saying something they had been sitting on long enough that it had to come out sideways. "When you first came in, I should have." Suhn-joon said nothing. "I have been running pack here for a long time. I know most of the people who come through this county." He pushed the drawer closed, and the sound of it settling into the frame was clean and final. "You do not feel like a stranger. I cannot locate where the recognition is coming from. It happens sometimes with pack echoes. Someone who moved through pack territory years ago and left a trace the memory cannot match to a face anymore." He looked up. "But I have been trying to place it since the first day, and I cannot." Suhn-joon set his pen down very carefully. "You have one of those," he said. It was not quite a question. "A few. From my father's pack. The ones I cannot locate are the ones that stay with me." Dong-hyun looked at him directly. "You do not feel like a trace. You feel like something closer than that." The room was very quiet. At the dock, the co-op cranes made their faint mechanical sound, distant and even and indifferent. "I have that kind of face," Suhn-joon said. Dong-hyun looked at him for a moment. "No," he said, and there was no challenge in it, just the quality of a man who had trusted his own read on things for long enough that he knew when it was telling him something. "You do not." Suhn-joon picked up his pen. He finished the note. He capped the pen and closed the file and told himself the commission was complete, and the correct next step was to invoice and leave. There was work in Astoria. There was work in Bend. His life had been built for exactly this: the moving, the finishing, the going on. He was almost at the door when Dong-hyun said behind him, "The exemption period expires at the end of the month." Suhn-joon stopped. "I know," he said. "After that you would need pack affiliation or you would have to leave the county." "I know." A pause. Suhn-joon did not turn around. "I am not pressuring you," Dong-hyun said. "I am telling you the situation." "I know," Suhn-joon said for the third time, which was not particularly articulate but was all he had available. He left the pack house. He walked to his truck and sat with the key in his hand longer than was necessary. Then he drove back to the rented room and told himself he was going to invoice, finalize, and book the next commission. He ordered more blockers instead, expedited from his usual supplier, and went to sleep. The shipping notification came the next morning. A delay at the distribution hub. The blockers would arrive in 2 days instead of 1. He read it twice. He calculated how many days remained in his current stock. 1 day. He drove to the pharmacy on the main road. Out of stock. Supply issue at the distributor. He called 2 pharmacies up the coast. Neither had stock. The client walkthrough at the pack house was scheduled for that morning. Canceling would require explanation. He did not want to explain this particular thing. He told himself it was fine. 1 day without the blockers was not a disaster. He was not in preheat, was nowhere near it, and the compound built up in the system well enough that a single day's gap produced a gradual shift, not a sudden one. 1 day was manageable. He drove to the pack house. The administrator walked through the finished piece with him, examined the hardware, checked the drawers, approved the work, and signed off on the invoice. Professional and clean. Suhn-joon thanked her, gathered his kit, and turned for the door. Dong-hyun came in from the far hallway. He came in with a folder under one arm, and the particular quality of someone mid-thought who had decided to come home before finishing it. And he almost moved through the foyer without stopping. Then he stopped. He stood in the foyer, and his eyes lost focus on anything in the room, and Suhn-joon watched him stop with the specific knowledge of what was happening and the specific inability to do anything about it. The blockers were down enough. The proximity was close enough. Dong-hyun was an alpha whose pack instincts had been running against something unnamed for weeks, pointed at a source they could not locate, and the source was 3 feet away with nothing left between them and the air. Dong-hyun turned toward him. Not the way you turn toward someone you had just noticed. The way you turn toward something your body had already made a decision about before the rest of you had time to catch up. His eyes closed. One full breath. When he opened them, his expression was entirely unlike anything Suhn-joon had seen on his face. Not warm, not cold, not performing anything. The expression of a man who has just found something at the edge of a place he thought he would already finished searching. "Tell me your name," Dong-hyun said. His voice was quiet. Not soft. Quiet. The difference mattered. Quiet was something held in by force. Suhn-joon looked at him. He had been standing in the space between inside and outside for his entire adult life. He had come back to this town with his eyes open. He had read the registry listing and accepted the commission and stood in this foyer before with this face looking at his and not finding what it was looking for. He thought for 1 second about giving a different name. "Suhn-joon," he said. The folder hit the floor. Dong-hyun looked at him. Not recognition. Not yet. Not the clean, complete arrival of a whole memory restored. The thing before that. The moment where the mind has found a shape it knows it has touched before, and the hand has not yet closed around it. And the mind is very still, because it understands that closing too quickly risks losing the thing again. His jaw was tight. His hands were at his sides. His breathing was very controlled in the way of someone managing something large with a small and precise grip. Suhn-joon looked back at him. He did not step forward. He did not step back. He had nowhere left to go in either direction, and he was done, he thought, performing which one he wanted. The co-op cranes ran at the dock. Somewhere in the back of the house a door closed. The foyer held everything it was holding, and Suhn-joon stood in the middle of it and waited and did not look away from the face that had known him. Once, before it forgot. Dong-hyun moved first. Not toward him. He bent and picked the folder up off the floor and straightened and held it against his chest with both arms crossed over it, the way a person held something when their hands needed to be doing anything at all. He looked at Suhn-joon for one more moment. Then he walked past him and went down the hall. His bedroom door closed. Not loudly, just closed. Suhn-joon stood in the foyer for a while longer. Then he picked up his kit and his file folder and walked out of the pack house and drove back to the room above the hardware shop and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his hands. He had known this was one of the possible outcomes. He had thought he had covered most of them during the months between reading the registry listing and buying the bus ticket. He had not quite covered this one, which was the door closing softly and Suhn-joon sitting on a bed in a rented room not knowing what any of it meant. He ate something. He slept badly. He woke in the gray early morning and lay on his back and listened to the fog-muffled sound of the co-op cranes starting up at the dock. The next day, Dong-hyun did not come to the pack house. Suhn-joon had already invoiced the commission. There was no professional reason for him to return. He went anyway because his toolkit was still in the dining room and he needed to collect it, and the administrator let him in with the same professional courtesy as always, and the dining room was empty. And the sideboard sat in the light with the quiet presence of a restored thing, and he packed his kit and left. The day after that, he went to the shore path alone. It was not something he had planned. He drove past the turnoff on the way back from the county office, and then stopped the truck and pulled a U-turn and drove to the trailhead. The fog was lower than usual. The path was mostly empty. He walked the full length of it, out to the flooded section and back, and stopped at the iron fence post and put his palm flat against the cold iron and stood there for a minute. It did not give him anything. It was an iron fence post that smelled faintly of Dong-hyun's palm, which was worse in a way he did not examine. He walked back to the truck. The blockers had arrived. He applied the new patch and told himself that was that, and went back to the room and opened his laptop and started looking at the next commission listings. The third day, Dong-hyun knocked on his door. Not early in the morning, not at a dramatic hour. Mid-afternoon, while Suhn-joon was sitting at the small table with the laptop and a sandwich, with his socks off because the room held heat unexpectedly well, and he had gotten comfortable in it in the way you only got comfortable in places you had been too long. He heard the knock and knew before he opened the door. There was no logical reason he should have known. He knew anyway. Dong-hyun was in his work clothes, the practical co-op clothes he wore to the office, and he had clearly come straight from somewhere else and then walked here instead of going home because there was a slight windedness about him that was not quite physical, but lived in his breathing. The breathing of a man who had been doing something internal at some pace for the last several hours. He looked at Suhn-joon in the doorway. "Can I come in?" he said. Suhn-joon stepped back from the door. The room was small, and Dong-hyun was large in the particular way of people who took up space, not through size, but through the quality of their presence, and with him in it, the room was suddenly very small. Suhn-joon sat on the edge of the bed because it was the only place to sit that was not the desk chair, and Dong-hyun stood for a moment and then sat in the desk chair and turned it to face him, and they looked at each other. Dong-hyun had, Suhn-joon realized, been carrying something in his face for the last 3 days that he was now putting down. Not the neutral he wore in public, not the careful attention he had been directing at Suhn-joon for weeks in the dining room. Something underneath all of that, something that had been sitting in him since the foyer and had been doing whatever it needed to do in private. "You were in my father's pack," Dong-hyun said. It was not a question. "Yes," Suhn-joon said. Dong-hyun was quiet for a moment, looking at his own hands on his knees. "I remembered you on the first night. Not your face. Not your name. A specific thing." He paused. "There was a morning, I would have been 17, where I came into the common room before anyone else was up, and someone was asleep on the floor. I almost stepped on him. He had folded his shoes and put them by his head, very neatly, like they were the only thing in the room that was his to take care of. He looked up. I did not wake him. I do not know why I remembered that specifically." Suhn-joon felt something move through him that was not comfortable. "That happened," he said. "I know it happened. I just did not know it was you." Dong-hyun's voice was careful. "When you said your name in the foyer, I had the shoes memory immediately. And then I had more after that. They came in pieces over 3 days." He stopped. "You were always there, at the edge of things. I could not find you in the faces I still knew from that time, and I understand now why. You were always at the edge." Suhn-joon said nothing. "I failed you," Dong-hyun said. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, without softening it or making it smaller. "Not because of any single thing I did, because you were close enough to be pack, and I never once made it formal. I let you exist in the space between, and I did not notice I was doing it." "You were 17, Suhn-joon said. "Yes. You could not have known what I wanted." "No," Dong-hyun said. "I could not have. But I am 30 now, and I know what it looks like to put your shoes neatly by your head because they are the only thing in the room that is yours." His voice did not change in volume or temperature. It was the same quiet. "I know what that costs a person. I am sorry I did not see it then. I am not making that mistake again." The room was very quiet. "What does that mean?" Suhn-joon said, not quite steadily. "That you are not making it again?" "It means I would like you to stay," Dong-hyun said. The afternoon light was coming through the single window of the rented room, flat and gray-white in the way of coastal light that had come through fog. It fell across Dong-hyun's hands on his knees, and across the floor between them, and across the edge of the bed where Suhn-joon was sitting. "I have been here for weeks," Suhn-joon said, "and you did not know who I was for most of them." "I know." You are asking me to stay on the basis of a few days of actually knowing. On the basis of a few days, Dong-hyun said, and whatever it was that my biology has been trying to tell me since the first afternoon in the dining room, which was clearly not nothing. Suhn-joon looked at him. You looked right through me. Yes. Dong-hyun did not flinch from it. I did. I am sorry for that too. I am not saying it to make you feel bad. I know. I am saying I am sorry because I am. He met Suhn-joon's eyes. You came back here knowing who I was. You came back knowing I might not know who you were. That took something that I do not have a simple word for, and I do not want to let it go without saying that I know what it cost. Suhn-joon looked at the floor. He looked at it for long enough that the afternoon light shifted slightly, which it did in rooms like this where the window was small. I was going to leave, he said. I had the next commission lined up. Where? Astoria. Dong-hyun was quiet for a moment. Astoria is 40 minutes north. Suhn-joon looked up. I know where Astoria is, he said. I know you do, Dong-hyun said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that was almost nothing, and was still the most that Suhn-joon had ever seen on his face in the direction of something warm and undone. I am telling you the distance. Suhn-joon felt the thing in his chest that had been sitting there since the foyer do something it had not done in all the years he had been managing it, which was to stop pretending it was manageable. 40 minutes is not far, he said carefully. No, Dong-hyun said. It is not. They looked at each other across the small room with the gray afternoon light between them and the sound of the co-op cranes at the dock coming faintly through the window. And Suhn-joon thought about all the years of edges, all the rooms he had stood at the boundary of, all the time he had spent making himself small enough to fit in spaces that were not quite meant for him. I need the Astoria commission, he said. The money is already confirmed. I am not asking you to cancel it. I know. He paused. I am saying I will come back after. Dong-hyun looked at him. Something in his face settled, not dramatically, but the way things settled when they had finally been placed where they were supposed to go. Okay, he said. Just that. The word landed between them like something returned. The Astoria commission took 3 weeks. A dining set, 8 chairs, and a table. The kind of work that was satisfying in its repetitiveness, and that required him to be present rather than somewhere else in his head. He was present with it. He worked steadily and well, which was the only way he knew how to work. Dong-hyun texted the way he did most things without performance. A photograph of the dining room on the morning the fog came in thicker than usual and filled the pack house windows with white. A message that said only the tide flooded the path today. Suhn-joon sent back a photograph of the Astoria table's carved legs and a note that the additional detail required an extra week. Dong-hyun's response was, good, which was also not a statement that required analysis, and Suhn-joon did not analyze it, and the additional week felt like less than the weeks before it had. He drove back to Harrow's Bend on a Tuesday, late enough that the fog had come in and the cranes had stopped. He had not told Dong-hyun exactly when. He pulled up to the pack house past 7 in the evening, and the lights were on in the front room and the kitchen, and he knocked. Dong-hyun opened the door. He was not in work clothes. An old dark sweater, bare feet on the hallway floor, and he looked at Suhn-joon on the doorstep with an expression that was not complicated. He stepped back from the door. Suhn-joon walked in. The pack house in the evening was different from the pack house during the day. The work lamp was off in the dining room. The sideboard sat in the low ambient light from the hall, the restored wood warm and settled, the hardware in its place. Suhn-joon looked at it as he passed. It looked exactly as it should. It looked like itself. They ate in the kitchen. Dong-hyun had made something practical and good, not made to impress, but because it needed making. They sat across from each other and ate and talked about the Astoria commission and the carved legs. Dong-hyun asked questions the way he always did, with the attention of someone who was going to remember what he was told. The chair joints were older than the table, Suhn-joon said. Different maker. Whoever assembled the set later matched the style but did not match the period. You can tell when you get into the joinery. Can you see it when it is finished? Not usually. You would have to know what to look for. Dong-hyun looked at him across the table. You always know what to look for. It was not a compliment exactly. It was an observation. An accurate one. Suhn-joon picked up his glass and did not perform modesty about it. After dinner they sat in the front room, low chairs and a lamp in the corner, and the water distantly audible through the walls. Dong-hyun sat near the lamp. Suhn-joon sat in the other chair, not as far as he would have placed himself a month ago. The room was quiet in the way that happened between people who did not need to fill it. After a while, Dong-hyun said, "There are things from that time that I cannot get back clearly. People I know were there but whose faces I cannot find." Suhn-joon looked at the lamp. "I am one of them," he said. Not accusatory, just true. You were. You are not anymore. The lamp put out a circle of warm light that reached the space between the two chairs, and not much further. The pack house settled around them with its old wood sounds, the particular language of a building that had been standing long enough to know how to hold people in it. "I thought about what you said," Suhn-joon said. "About the shoes." Dong-hyun waited. "I had not thought about that morning in a long time." He paused. "I would forgotten you almost stepped on me." "I did not almost," Dong-hyun said. "I did step on the edge of the blanket. You did not wake up." Suhn-joon looked at him. "You remember that." "I remember being careful not to step on you after that. I am not sure I did a very good job of it in the larger sense." A pause. "I kept the memory of the shoes because something in it felt important. I did not know what." "And now?" Dong-hyun looked at him steadily. "Now I think I was recognizing something I did not have language for yet. That there was a person in my pack who had made himself into something that took up the minimum possible space. And I found it worth remembering." He stopped. "I should have found it worth doing something about." Suhn-joon sat with that for a moment. "You were 17, he said again. "I keep being 17 for a reason," Dong-hyun said. "What is yours?" Suhn-joon looked at him. "My reason for what?" "For keeping coming back to my age when I apologize." The lamp put out its steady light. The water was distant and even at the walls. "Because I was invisible by choice," Suhn-joon said. "That is not something you can fix from the outside. I made myself hard to see. You cannot apologize for not seeing something that was hiding." Dong-hyun was quiet for a moment. "You are not hiding now." "No," Suhn-joon said. "I am not." The sentence sat between them in the warm and quiet room, and Dong-hyun looked at him with the quality of attention he had always given things that mattered, and Suhn-joon looked back and did not move to the edge of anything. It was late when Suhn-joon stood to leave. Dong-hyun walked him to the door, which was not necessary, but which he did anyway, in the way he did things that did not require explanation. At the door, Suhn-joon stopped and turned, and they were close in the narrow hallway, closer than they had been in the dining room or on the shore path, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Dong-hyun raised his hand and pressed the backs of his fingers very briefly against Suhn-joon's jaw, the inside of his wrist near the scent gland against the side of Suhn-joon's face, not quite assenting, just the edge of one, just enough for the warmth of it to transfer, and Suhn-joon stood very still and let him. Dong-hyun lowered his hand. "Drive carefully," he said. "You live 10 minutes from my rental," Suhn-joon said. "Yes," Dong-hyun said, the corner of his mouth. "Drive carefully." Suhn-joon drove carefully. He lay on the bed in the rental room with his hand over the side of his face where the warmth had been and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like someone who was not standing at the edge of a room but inside it. In the morning, Dong-hyun texted, "Breakfast, and then a time, and then the pack house address, as though Suhn-joon had not been there enough times now to know it in the dark. He went. They ate at the kitchen table with the morning fog at the windows, and it was the most ordinary thing Suhn-joon had done in years, and he felt it in his chest like something structural. Over the following weeks, Suhn-joon took the next commission in Harrow's Bend on purpose. There was work at the old library, 3 reading chairs, and a roll-top desk that had been sitting in storage since the building's last renovation, water damaged and largely given up on by everyone except one librarian who had submitted the restoration inquiry. The chairs were in worse shape than the desk. The desk was in worse shape than the photographs suggested. Suhn-joon settled into it with the quiet satisfaction of work that was going to take a while. He was registered with the pack by then. Not through the exemption. Actually registered, which required a meeting with Dong-hyun in his formal capacity as Pack Alpha, which was the most professionally uncomfortable 10 minutes of Suhn-joon's adult life, signing paperwork across a desk from a man who had pressed the inside of his wrist against his face 4 days earlier. "This is ridiculous," Suhn-joon said, signing the second form. "County requirement," Dong-hyun said, with the quality of someone performing the activity of not laughing. "You could have sent it by mail." "I could have," Dong-hyun said. He took the signed form. "You are officially affiliated. Welcome to the pack." Suhn-joon looked at him across the desk. "That is the least ceremonial thing anyone has ever said. Would you prefer a ceremony?" "No." "Then this works," Dong-hyun said. It was the most ordinary conversation, and the least ordinary thing. And Suhn-joon drove to the library afterward and stood in front of the water-damaged roll-top for a while before he could bring himself to start the assessment. The chairs came back first, the way repairs always went, the simpler things yielding before the complex ones. He brought the first 2 finished chairs to the library, and the librarian, a woman in her 60s who had clearly not expected them to be salvageable, stood in the storage room and looked at them for a long moment. "I thought they were gone," she said. "People always think that," Suhn-joon said. "They are not usually gone." She looked at him with the expression people sometimes had when they understood that he was talking about more than the chairs. He was not talking about more than the chairs. He went back to the desk. The desk took the rest of the month. During that time, Suhn-joon ate breakfast at the pack house on most mornings when Dong-hyun was not at the co-op before 6. He learned that Dong-hyun made better coffee than anyone had a right to make before being fully awake. He learned that the pack house in the very early morning had a quality of light that came through the east-facing kitchen window at a specific angle and turned the oak of the kitchen table the same color as the sideboard in the dining room, and that this was the hour when Dong-hyun was most himself, without the weight of whatever the day would require. Dong-hyun learned, in the same incremental way, things about Suhn-joon that Suhn-joon had never volunteered to anyone. That he took his coffee black because he had gotten used to it, and now milk and coffee tasted wrong to him. That he kept his tools in a specific order, and if anything was moved, he would spend several minutes quietly not saying anything until he found what had been displaced. That he fixed things in rooms he was in, small things, a loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet, a window that did not quite seat in its frame, and never mentioned having done it. Dong-hyun noticed every time, and also never mentioned it. One morning, Dong-hyun set his coffee cup down and looked at the kitchen cabinet hinge. The hinge was no longer loose. It had not been loose for about 2 weeks. "You fixed it," he said. "It was loose," Suhn-joon said. Dong-hyun looked at him. "There are 6 things in this kitchen you have fixed since you started coming here." There were 6 things that needed fixing. Dong-hyun looked at him for a moment longer. Then he picked up his coffee cup and drank from it, and said nothing further about it. But something in his face had changed in the small, permanent way of someone who had just been given information that was going to stay with them. The desk was finished on a Friday at the end of the month, and Suhn-joon delivered it to the library and stood back and watched the librarian open and close the roll top 3 times in a row with an expression of disbelief that was very gratifying. And then he drove back to the rental room and packed his bag. He was sitting on the edge of the bed with the packed bag on the floor when his phone rang. It was Dong-hyun. "Are you at the rental?" Dong-hyun said. "Yes." "Are you packed?" Suhn-joon looked at the bag. "Yes." "Do not leave yet," Dong-hyun said. "I am coming." The line went quiet. Suhn-joon sat with the phone in his hand and looked at the packed bag and then at the room that had been his for 2 months. The small window, the particular angle of the afternoon light, the hardware shop sounds coming up through the floor. Dong-hyun knocked 15 minutes later, not softly, with the knock of someone who had walked from wherever he would been to here at a pace that was not quite running but was not ordinary walking either. Suhn-joon opened the door. Dong-hyun was not windless. He had walked fast, and it was in his breathing, and he looked at Suhn-joon in the doorway with an expression that was not performing anything at all. The same expression he had worn in the foyer on the day the blockers ran out. The man at the edge of something he had found and was not going to let go of this time through silence or through waiting. "I know you have another commission," Dong-hyun said. "I know you have had the next one lined up for 2 weeks. I know the work moves, and that is what the work does, and I am not asking you to change that." He stopped. "I am asking you to come back, not as a practical arrangement, not as a pack affiliation for the work period, as someone who is coming back because this is where I am." Suhn-joon stood in the doorway. "You said that in October," he said, "when you came to this room the first time." "Yes," Dong-hyun said. "I did. And I said I would come back after Astoria." "Yes. And I did." Dong-hyun looked at him. "And then you packed your bag." "I always pack my bag," Suhn-joon said. "I have been packing my bag, and leaving, and coming back for 2 months." "I know," Dong-hyun said. "I would like you to pack the bag and know you are coming back before you have left." Suhn-joon looked at him standing in the doorway of the rented room in the afternoon light, in his work clothes, slightly out of breath. The man who had looked through him in a dining room and spent 3 days with what that cost, who apologized by naming the wound, who noticed every hinge Suhn-joon fixed and never made him perform modesty about his work, who pressed the inside of his wrist against his face at a front door and called it drive carefully. "The next commission is in Seaside," Suhn-joon said. "I know where Seaside is," Dong-hyun said. "It is 35 minutes. "Yes." "Less than Astoria." "Yes," Dong-hyun said. Suhn-joon looked at him for a moment longer. Then he stepped back from the door. Dong-hyun came in. He stood in the small room and looked at the packed bag on the floor. Then he looked at Suhn-joon. "Are you coming back?" he said, not performing, not soft, the quiet that was held in. "Yes," Suhn-joon said. "I am coming back." Dong-hyun crossed the room and stood in front of him and raised his hand, and this time did not stop at the edge of assenting. He cupped the side of Suhn-joon's face, his palm warm, the scent gland at his wrist pressing lightly against the scent gland at Suhn-joon's jaw, and Suhn-joon tipped his head slightly into it, which was the first voluntary thing he had done in the direction of what he wanted in more years than he was going to count. Dong-hyun's other hand came to his shoulder, steadying, not pulling, present. "I have been trying to figure out," Dong-hyun said, quiet and close, "when it became this specific. The recognition? The wanting to keep you in the room." His thumb moved slightly against Suhn-joon's jaw. "My instincts had you from the first afternoon. I did not understand what they were telling me." "You looked at my wrist scent gland in the first 10 minutes, Suhn-joon said. Dong-hyun's expression shifted in the way it did when he was not going to confirm something directly. "I was assessing a stranger. You brought me water. Pack hospitality. You told Yoo-jin to back off about the assessment." Dong-hyun was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I did." Suhn-joon looked at him, this close, the warm pressure of his palm still at Suhn-joon's face. "You did not know who I was." "No," Dong-hyun said. "My knowing and my wanting were working on different schedules." Something shifted in Suhn-joon's chest that had been held in a particular shape for a very long time. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way old wood settled into new glue, slowly and with pressure and into something that was going to hold. He put his hand over Dong-hyun's hand at his jaw. Dong-hyun's eyes dropped to that, then back up. And the corner of his mouth did what it did, that small thing that was not nothing. And then he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against Suhn-joon's, and they stood like that in the small rented room with the afternoon light going gray outside and the co-op sounds below, not moving, just present in the way that Dong-hyun had always been present, which was completely, and which Suhn-joon had been watching from the edge of rooms for most of his life, and was now, at last, inside. After a while, Suhn-joon said, "I need to return the room key by 5. "I know," Dong-hyun said. He did not move. "It is 4:40. I know. Suhn-joon felt against everything that had been the shape of him for years, the beginning of a laugh. It arrived without warning and was not large but was entirely real, and it happened at the exact point where Dong-hyun's forehead was pressed against his, which meant Dong-hyun felt it too, felt the change in him, and something in Dong-hyun's breathing softened in response. 440, Dong-hyun said. 440, Suhn-joon said. Dong-hyun straightened. He kept his hand at Suhn-joon's face for a moment longer and then let it fall. He looked at him with the particular look he had when he was filing something away into the permanent part of his memory, the same look he had given the kit, the tools that had belonged to the woman in Northern California. Go return the key, he said. Come to dinner after. Okay, Suhn-joon said. He picked up the bag. Dong-hyun held the door. At the top of the stairs, Suhn-joon stopped and turned around. Dong-hyun was still standing in the doorway of the empty room, watching him, with his arms at his sides and his expression uncomplicated, and the hallway light falling across him in a way that made him look exactly like the person he was, which was a man who showed up and waited and did not perform either the waiting or the showing up. I put my shoes by my head, Suhn-joon said, because they were the only thing in the room that no one else had a claim to. Dong-hyun looked at him. I know, he said. That is why I remembered it. Suhn-joon turned and went down the stairs. He returned the room key at 4:58. He drove to the pack house and parked in the spot along the side of the building that had become, without discussion, his spot, and carried his bag inside and set it in the hallway. The bag that had always represented the next departure, sitting in the hallway of the place he was coming back to. Dong-hyun did not make a thing of the bag in the hallway. He made dinner. They ate. The kitchen was warm, and the fog was at the windows, and the pack house settled around them, all that accumulated living pressing gently on every surface. Suhn-joon sat at the kitchen table in the low lamplight and drank his black coffee and felt that he was inside the room, not at the edge. Inside, at the table, in the light, with his bag in the hallway and Dong-hyun across the table reading manifests with half his attention and giving the other half to Suhn-joon in the way he always had, completely and without making a performance of it. Outside, the fog sat on the water, and the cranes were still. Inside, the oak of the kitchen table was warm in the lamplight. The sideboard in the next room held its initials in the dark behind the panel, which was enough, which had always been enough, to know they were there. The end. I appreciate you listening. If you enjoyed the story, drop your thoughts in the comments. I would love to read them.